This painting, called Houses with Figures, which is really a view of the Campo, the very large Campo San Stefano, is a good example of what one means by Morrice and modernism. First off, is a huge campo of which he shows very, very little. And in fact, not only in terms of the breadth, but in the width, because in all likelihood, we know where Morrice is sitting, and he's made the distance between where he's sitting and the buildings shrunk a little bit. In fact, there was such a huge campo that they used to have bullfighting in the campo till it was outlawed. Typically of a modernist painting, nothing happens. You have a pavement, you have a woman walking, a woman wearing a dark shawl, walking towards the Academia Bridge, and then you have two other shawled black women in black shawls walking north towards, actually towards the Basilica San Marco. So that's it. And a slice of a very long wall of architecture, of buildings. And in fact, Morrice has eliminated or chose not to include the buildings to the right, which actually are quite magnificent. So these are very standard 16th century domestic architecture. He doesn't show the whole building. He crops on either side. And this is how one would see the building without turning your head. You're looking directly ahead of him, and this is within, his range of vision, what he would see. What fascinates him is the patterning which is true to life as it is to the painting, because Morrice is always very accurate. The patterning of the windows, this building actually is joined to another one, and it's an ochre building with brown shutters, and then the dark passageway, the dark street, which is as narrow as he suggests actually, and then the pattern of the windows on the double building beside it. Below, we know that it's early afternoon, because the canopies and the canopies are drawn around the restaurants and cafes and shops. In fact, this was a pharmacy in the 16th century. It's a pharmacy when Morrice was there, and it's a pharmacy today. The quietude is also very modernist. We see what he sees, and no more and no less. And even though for a change he does show the full height of the building, right behind it, and he crops this, is the belfry of the Church of Santo Stefano, after which the Campo is named. So he still is cropping. He's still, you think he's showing you a lot, but he's showing you actually very little. The only action is the women walking very quietly, who are completely oblivious to anybody looking at them. The color, so there's a sense of intimacy, even though, as I'm saying, it's a huge space. The color is extremely tonal. Morrice's range of color, the tubes of color that he uses are very limited. The way he blends those few tubes is very unique and very marvelous. And so one has in any of the facades just a range of different tonalities, and this is how Morrice makes the paint work. And the repetition of shapes is also something that's very much of modernist. Something that's very Morrice is the soft geometry that derives originally from the architecture, and also is the armature that constructs the painting. And I say it's soft geometry because these buildings are 4 centuries old. at least 4 centuries old, if not more. And there's none of it is straight. So these are not nice, neat rectangles. And there's no straight line in Venice. The streets aren't straight, the windows aren't straight, the walls aren't straight. And when we look at the painting, you realize even though he respects very much the pattern of the windows, each window's a little different. Each one bends a little more, which gives this very, very gentle and very subtle familiarity to the building. These aren't monuments. These are places where people lived. And that's very much part of modernism, which we expect when we see Impressionist paintings, because they're doing familiar things to insert that kind of modernism on a historic and internationally famous building, a city with these monumental buildings, and make them look like something that you see every day, is some of the best aspects of Morrice's modernism. In this painting, which is another Campo, he does something completely different than he had done before. In most of the paintings in the exhibition, and certainly in terms of the Santo Stefano, he's looking directly ahead. Here, he didn't. We actually do have a rectangular square or campo, as happens in Santo Stefano. But Morrice positions himself in a corner of the square and looks diagonally across. As a result, instead of his usual horizontal, vertical, banded composition, he creates this big triangle, this big diagonal, which is extremely rare for him, which is what makes this painting rather wonderful. Once again, painting is slightly more loosely painted. It has many of the same qualities as the Santo Stefano, because the architecture is precise. His architecture is always precise. Here he hasn't filled in the details exactly, but if you do look at photographs or actually look at the place itself, you'll know it is a replica of the architecture and the layers of architecture. Venice is a very closed-in city, and so you may look at one space, but you're always going to see hints of what's behind it. Here, to add to the familiarity of the place, you can see in the background a little market stall, which was common in all of the Campo. And here, the figures have a more prominent role. There's a young girl dressed in this frothy, pinky white dress, and she shows up in a lot of his paintings, facing a woman who was probably her nursemaid, the person who took care of her, a popolano in this case, wearing a brown shawl but with a gorgeous pink skirt underneath. We don't know what's going on between them. She is the little girl trying to convince her caretaker to come into the square or play, or is the popolano trying to suggest to the little girl that they have to go home or they have to keep on walking. But there's a dialogue of which we're the witnesses to their interplay, in the same way that Morrice is the witness to what's going on. And this is very modernist, is that we see what he sees, and we know as much as he knows, or we know as little as he knows. Again, it's interesting in terms of this very simple but what appears to be simple but isn't, a very, very complicated composition. He tells you a lot about San Angelo that makes this Campo different, for instance, from Santo Stefano. It's a raised Campo, and that's why there's 3 steps and railing, and this is extremely unusual in Venice that any of these still exist. The shape in the middle is actually a well, which is the source of all Venetian water, and beside it is a very everyday kiosk for selling magazines and newspapers. So once more, it's Venice, the architectural wonder. At the same time, it's Venice, the place where people live and life just goes on. His way of painting shows up very well in this blown up detail that's behind me. You can see that Morrice's brushstroke, even though he looks like he painted the work very quickly, is really a very dense pattern of paint that's applied in geometrical or rectangular brushstrokes, a horizontal, a vertical, a horizontal, a vertical. And by seeing, then this is where the blow-ups are so handy, as you can see, it's not, he painted very deliberately, and he painted relatively slowly, so that we have, there's a kind of a disconnect between what it looks like and how it was done. But that's not new. That's exactly what the Impressionists did, as something which was called painting quickly, that you paint very deliberately, very carefully, very specifically, to give the impression that you're painting quickly. And also with the blow-up, you can see here in terms of how much he's or has not developed the details of the picture. What's very interesting is that in my research, the only thing I've ever found that has anything to do with this, to the preparation of this image, is a drawing, and a very careful drawing, of the 3 steps and the ironwork on the side of the stairs. This is the only known drawing. And I found the drawing, had no idea, saw the drawing in a sketchbook, but I had no idea what it belonged to, because it actually looked like, it resembled steps that lead to the water. But that would have meant that Morrice was standing in the water, which was impossible, to paint it. So it was always a mystery what that drawing was. And then when I finally saw the painting, everything fell into place to realize, because it was a raised campo. And I never thought of that because there aren't very many of them, which is, but here you could see how just, you know, the colors, by the way, are correct. In Venice, there is a very large proliferation of green shutters. So the green isn't just because the color looks good against the ochre and the yellows. It is the color of the shutters. One thing that Morrice always does is changes his brushstroke very slightly to differentiate different textures, different surfaces. And so while the shutters have a kind of zigzag movement to the brush, and similarly with the windows below, the wall of the building, the facade of the building, seems to be quite regularly horizontal pattern and overlay of horizontals and vertical brush strokes. You can see in the detail how very little of her dress he's shown, but there's enough that we completely accept it. Here in the version of the Popolana, her very distinctive hairstyle with a top knot, and her shawl with a pointed end, again, is very typical. It's a short shawl, which means it's the summer, and her wearing a bright skirt is not an anomaly. We're used to, as in the Santo Stefano painting, to see women in black. Black clothing. If you were young and unmarried, you could wear bright clothes. So presumably that's what's going on here. And in Morrice's sketchbooks, there are numerous drawings of Papalana, and he was very fascinated by their shape and by their proliferation in the city. That's another thing that's, I think, and it's important to Morrice's painting and to understanding Venice at the time. The Papalana weren't shoved off into any sort of corner. They walked through the city in the same way that the tourists did. And he gives her a characterization simply by the way he just turns her head slightly, turns one shoulder is higher than the other. So even though we see her from the back, he gives her a personality through the shape of her body, and the little girl feels the absolute charm of that figure. Morrice had a little sister, Annie, and this might explain why, who he was very fond of, and it might explain why in so many of the Venetian pictures there is a little girl.